big upcoming projects, and he's there for his new big Mission Impossible film. But before he showed footage to the audience, he asked everybody to take a moment of silence, and here's what he had to say. "I'd like to honor a dear friend of mine, Val Kilmer. I can't tell you how much I admire his work, how grateful and honored I was when he joined Top Gun and came back later for Top Gun Maverick."
For years, Tom Cruise said nothing. Not a word about the one man who defined Top Gun alongside him. But now, after Val Kilmer's quiet, heartbreaking death, Cruise has finally broken his silence. And what he revealed? It's not just emotional, it's unforgettable. A secret friendship, a final scene that nearly didn't happen, and a private goodbye that no one saw coming. Why did Cruise wait so long? What did he really feel about Val's final days? And what message did he leave behind? Money that brought everyone to tears. Stay with us, because the truth is deeper than anyone imagined. The shocking yet silent goodbye. Val Kilmer passed away on April 1st, 2025. It wasn't the kind of Hollywood goodbye most stars receive. No sweeping tributes on red carpets, no flashing cameras or lavish memorials. Just a soft exit into the silence, fitting for a man who had lived his final decade away from the spotlight. He was 65. Known for some of the most iconic roles in modern cinema, Iceman in Top Gun, Jim Morrison in The Doors, and Batman in Batman Forever, Val Kilmer was once the embodiment of 90s charisma. But in the end, his departure was as private as his illness had been. And then, just a few days after his passing, the silence broke. Not from the media, not from Hollywood insiders. It came from someone who knew Val not just as a co-star, but as a friend. Tom Cruise, Kilmer's legendary Top Gun counterpart, released a quiet, heartfelt statement. Just one line. But it hit with the weight of decades. Without Val, there would be no Iceman. And there would be no me as I am today. It wasn't about publicity. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was real. After years of keeping their bond out of the public eye, Cruise had finally spoken. And it wasn't just a tribute. It was a recognition of everything Val had been, to him and to the world. And from that moment, people began looking at Val Kilmer's story not as a tragic end, but a powerful life lived on his own terms. The bond between Maverick and Iceman. When audiences first saw Maverick and Iceman go head-to-head in Top Gun, it was pure lightning on screen. Tom Cruise's reckless charm against Val Kilmer's icy precision. The rivalry felt real, and in many ways, it was. Both men were young, fiercely dedicated to their craft, and already on paths towards superstardom. But what began as cinematic competition evolved into something far more meaningful off-screen. Respect. Over the years, their bond grew quietly. While Cruise soared through blockbuster after blockbuster, and Kilmer took the more winding, introspective path, their friendship remained. It wasn't the kind that lived in tabloids or award show appearances. It was built in the margins, in quiet conversations, occasional visits, and mutual admiration. When Top Gun Maverick was in early development, Kilmer wasn't even on the initial cast list. His health had severely declined. He had lost most of his voice and struggled with mobility. But Tom Cruise wasn't having it. He personally lobbied to bring Val back, not as a token, but because he believed Maverick wouldn't be complete without Iceman. And he didn't stop there. Cruise visited Kilmer multiple times at his ranch in New Mexico, offering not pressure, but presence. In the world of Hollywood, where relationships can be fleeting and performative, this one stood out. It was real, it was private, and as Cruise would later say, "I didn't just want Val in the film, I needed him there." A role that came full circle. Val Kilmer's final major screen appearance was a return to the role that helped define his career. Iceman. In Top Gun Maverick 2022, audiences were stunned to see him back. Older, frailer, but still commanding the screen with an undeniable presence. It wasn't just a nostalgic cameo. It was a full-circle moment, crafted with care and intention. Tom Cruise pushed for this return, knowing how much it meant to fans and to Val himself. Despite Kilmer's inability to speak due to the damage from throat cancer, the filmmakers used advanced AI voice technology to recreate his voice from old recordings, interviews, and film dialogue. It was a remarkable achievement. But what mattered more was the emotion behind the scene. In just a few minutes of screen time, Kilmer and Cruise delivered one of the most powerful cinematic moments of the decade. Their characters shared no elaborate action sequences, just a quiet, emotional conversation that resonated far beyond the script. For many, it felt like two old friends saying goodbye. Not just their characters, but the men behind them. Val's face said everything his voice could not, and Cruise's response, filled with restrained emotion, told audiences all they needed to know. It was about honoring the past, reconciling the present, and capturing the bond that had survived decades. A role that once launched them both into icon status had now become the canvas for a silent farewell. Behind the one-day shoot Kilmer's appearance in Top Gun, Maverick was shot in under 24 hours, but that one day carried more emotional weight than an entire franchise. On set, everyone knew this wasn't just another scene. It was something deeper. Crew members reportedly cried during filming. The energy was heavy, reverent, almost sacred. Tom Cruise didn't treat it like a favor or a nostalgic reunion. He treated it like a mission. He stayed on set longer than necessary, making sure Kilmer felt supported and comfortable. The two men shared moments that weren't captured on film, but their emotional resonance lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. There was something poetic about the way it was done. Kilmer didn't need grand speeches or spotlighted moments. He just needed a space to be present, one last time. And Cruise made sure he got that. The scene, brief as it was, became one of the most talked about moments in the film. Not because of flashy effects or plot twists, but because of what it represented. Closure, legacy, brotherhood. It was unscripted in emotion, unforced in execution, and unforgettable to anyone who saw it. Val Kilmer's private battle. Long before that scene was filmed, Kilmer was fighting a battle most of the world didn't know about. In 2014, fans began to notice the changes. His appearance had become gaunt, and he avoided interviews. Rumors swirled, but Kilmer remained silent. For 3 years, he denied being ill. It wasn't until 2017 that he finally acknowledged the truth. He was battling throat cancer. By that point, the disease had progressed significantly. He underwent chemotherapy, radiation, and 2 tracheotomies that left him unable to speak. His once iconic voice, described by Oliver Stone as like a classical instrument, was reduced to hoarse whispers and fragments of sound. He withdrew from the public eye, retreating to his ranch in New Mexico, where he spent his time painting, writing, and rewatching old films. It was during these years of silence that he prepared the most meaningful work of his life, not for screens, but for his children. Tom Cruise, amid his nonstop global career, made time to visit. It wasn't about rekindling stardom, it was about friendship. In the world Kilmer chose to inhabit, quiet, introspective, full of memory, Cruise remained a thread to the past, a connection that never faded. And that says everything about who Val let into his final chapter. A will unlike any other. When Kilmer passed, what he left behind wasn't a traditional estate. Yes, there were assets, royalties, investments, property, but the heart of his will was something much deeper. Legacy, in the truest sense. Just 48 hours after his death, his longtime attorney gathered the family in Los Angeles and presented a 27-page document. But this wasn't about legalities. It was about love. Val had spent years preparing it, compiling videos, handwritten letters, and photo collections. Each item was created with intention, each message a final word to those he loved. His daughter Mercedes and son Jack weren't just inheriting assets. They were receiving curated memories. Included were encrypted hard drives full of personal videos organized by year. In them, Kilmer addressed his children directly, telling stories, reflecting on his past, and saying the words he couldn't speak in person. It was an act of love so meticulous, so tender, that even the attorney called it one of the most moving estate distributions he'd ever seen. And Tom Cruise? He was aware. According to those close to Kilmer, Cruise knew about the videos, but never spoke of them publicly. Out of respect, out of reverence for his friend who had chosen, once again, to speak quietly but profoundly. Letters that made everyone cry. Among the most emotional parts of the will were the letters and artifacts left for Mercedes and Jack. To Mercedes, Kilmer gave a handcrafted wooden box filled with over 300 unpublished photos, from the dazzling days on set to quiet mornings in the New Mexico kitchen. One photo stood out, a framed image of father and daughter behind their ranch, a place Kilmer called his stillness. For Jack, the gift was even more layered, a handwritten, unfinished film script. On the cover, in Val's handwriting, "For Jack, if you're ready to tell your story." It wasn't just a script. It was a passing of the torch, a challenge, a blessing. Alongside it, a letter addressed to Jack at age 30, read aloud by the lawyer during the will presentation. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But everything you need to understand me is right here, in every word, every silence." That line alone broke the room. Kilmer's goodbye wasn't dramatic or performative. It was structured, honest, and overflowing with meaning. Cruise later shared that reading those letters, even secondhand, left him speechless. "Val always knew how to say something with silence," he said. "And somehow, even after he's gone, he still does." Letters that made everyone cry. What Val Kilmer left behind wasn't just a will. It was a final act of fatherhood. The legacy he created for his children went far beyond wealth or fame. For Mercedes, he curated a handcrafted wooden box filled with more than 300 unpublished photos. Each image was carefully selected, capturing moments from their life together. Set photos from Top Gun, quiet mornings in their New Mexico kitchen, handwritten captions on the back. One photo was framed, a quiet moment behind the ranch, the same spot where Kilmer once wrote a screenplay titled Salt Sky, still unpublished, still deeply personal. But perhaps the most emotional inheritance was what he left for Jack, a handwritten, unfinished film script. The front page held a single sentence: "For Jack, if you're ready to tell your story." It wasn't just a creative baton. It was an invitation, a challenge, and a message of trust. Alongside the script was a typed letter, read aloud by the family attorney. In it, Val wrote, "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But everything you need to understand me is right here, in every word, every silence." That sentence alone brought the room to tears, not just because of what it said, but because of who it came from. A man who had spent the last decade unable to speak, choosing instead to communicate through memories, gestures, and carefully crafted legacy pieces. Tom Cruise would later reflect on these letters privately with Jack and Mercedes. He wouldn't talk about it publicly, but sources close to the family say Tom's eyes welled up when he heard the words. "Val found a way to say goodbye," he said. "He edited his final scene in real life. And in the end, those letters became a script of their own. One written not for theaters, but for hearts. One meant to be remembered, not performed. The man Hollywood couldn't define. To the outside world, Val Kilmer was a movie star. But to those who worked beside him, or knew him beyond the screen, he was something else entirely. A contradiction, a storm, a stillness. A man who never let the industry define who he was. He rose to fame quickly in the 80s and 90s. With breakout roles in Top Secret and Top Gun, it would have been easy for him to chase commercial success. But that wasn't his path. He turned down major roles that most actors would have begged for. He clashed with studios. Directors sometimes labeled him difficult, but it wasn't ego, it was principle. Kilmer believed in the art. He believed in the weight of every word, the honesty of every performance. From his haunting portrayal of Jim Morrison in The Doors to the unforgettable Doc Holliday in Tombstone, Kilmer gave everything to the craft. Not to please, not to profit, but to express something real. Tom Cruise once said, "Val was the kind of actor who made you raise your game." And that wasn't a compliment. It was a confession. Kilmer's energy on set was intense, focused. He didn't waste time. He didn't tolerate shortcuts. And he never, ever did it for the fame. As his health declined and the roles slowed, Kilmer didn't try to claw his way back. He didn't chase relevancy. He went inward. He wrote. He painted. He edited old footage from his films. He worked in silence. He created for himself and for the people he loved. Even at the peak of his fame, Kilmer kept a distance from the Hollywood machine. And now, in the wake of his passing, that distance feels like proof of how deeply he understood the difference between being seen and being known. Family. First, fame second. If there was one truth that guided Val Kilmer's final years, it was this. Family was everything. Behind the characters, behind the fame, behind the myth, he was simply a father. And that role, unlike the others, never ended when the camera stopped rolling. After his divorce from actress Joanne Whalley, Kilmer made a conscious choice. Though their relationship had ended, his commitment to co-parenting never wavered. Despite the distance, she lived in the UK, he in the US, he remained ever present in his children's lives, but not as a celebrity, as dad. He raised Mercedes and Jack away from the spotlight. No red carpet appearances, no magazine covers. He never used his status to open doors for them in Hollywood. In fact, when they pursued acting, he made sure it was because they wanted to, not because of who he was. Both Mercedes and Jack have spoken about their father's quiet but profound influence. He never gave lessons or advice unless asked. Instead, he lived his values. He showed them that art wasn't about applause. It was about honesty. He taught them that integrity mattered more than attention. Jack recalls nights in New Mexico, watching old films with his father, analyzing camera angles and acting styles, not as an academic exercise, but as a shared passion. Mercedes remembers sitting in silence with him as he painted. No words exchanged, but everything understood. And when Val lost his voice, those lessons became even louder. His communication evolved into glances, into gestures, into art. He never stopped being their guide. He simply became quieter, more intentional. When the public saw Val Kilmer, they saw a star. But his children saw something far more meaningful. A man who edited every family video with care, wrote notes on the back of each photo, and saved his last words for them. Not the world. A creative life in the desert. When Val Kilmer moved away from Los Angeles in the early 2000s, many assumed he was retreating from Hollywood. But for Kilmer, it wasn't a retreat. It was a return to himself. He bought a sprawling 6,000-acre ranch in the desert of New Mexico, a place of quiet, a place of vastness, a place where the noise of the industry couldn't follow him. He called it his peace zone. And there, in that solitude, he became more creative than ever. Kilmer didn't stop working. He simply changed his canvas. He wrote screenplays, painted vivid, emotional works, took intimate photographs, and hosted private creative gatherings with a small circle of trusted friends. The ranch became his studio, his sanctuary, his world. It was hanging in that quiet desert that he filmed the private videos later discovered in his will. Hundreds of hours of footage, speaking to his children, reading poetry, reflecting on his life, telling jokes, sharing secrets. All of it meticulously edited and filed, not for the world to see, but for those who mattered most. Tom Cruise visited the ranch on more than one occasion, and according to those close to Kilmer, he was moved to silence by the space. "This is Val's soul on land," he once said. The ranch was never a hideaway. It was a stage without an audience. A place where Kilmer could still create, even when his body wouldn't let him speak. It was there that he found his truest voice, not in dialogue, but in intention. And now, with a part of his estate dedicated to preserving that land for future artists, Kilmer's creative spirit will echo through that desert long after he's gone. A memoir that spoke volumes. From the quiet solitude of his New Mexico ranch, Val Kilmer gave the world one last message in his own words. In 2000, he published his memoir, I'm Your Huckleberry, a title that nodded to his iconic role in Tombstone, but inside the pages, there was no performance. There was only truth. The book was more than a recounting of a career. It was an unfiltered exploration of pain, transformation, and purpose. Kilmer didn't sugarcoat his illness or lean into melodrama. He described the shock of losing his voice, the struggle to breathe, the isolation of living in silence, and the unexpected clarity that came with it. But through it all, there was no bitterness, just honesty. The most revealing parts weren't about Hollywood or fame, but about the quieter moments. His connection with his children, his spiritual journey, his artistic obsessions. There was a line that struck many readers, and one that Tom Cruise later quoted in private. "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of not living true to myself." It's that sentiment that seemed to shape Kilmer's final years. He lived simply, with intention. And this memoir was his bridge back to the public. A way to speak one last time on his own terms. For fans, it was a bittersweet gift. For friends like Cruise, it was a mirror held up to a man they thought they knew, but were still discovering. Following the memoir, Kilmer didn't speak much publicly again. He had said what he needed to say, and now he let the silence speak for him. In many ways, Your Huckleberry wasn't a memoir. It was a final monologue from an actor who no longer had a stage, but still had something vital to share. And what came next would only deepen the impact of that truth. A legacy of giving, not showing, while the world saw Val Kilmer as a larger-than-life figure. Behind the scenes, he was quietly shaping lives in ways that few ever knew. After his passing, new details emerged, not about roles or awards, but about the people he helped without ever seeking recognition. Kilmer had secretly funded a youth theater program in New Mexico for years. No public endorsements, no interviews, just anonymous donations that paid for kids to find. Their voice on stage, ironic perhaps, for a man who had lost his own. When the will was read, it revealed that he had also left a portion of his estate to continue supporting arts education for underprivileged children. It was one of many subtle footprints he left behind. He also donated to cancer research, again without publicizing it. Even in illness, he didn't want sympathy. He wanted progress. He wanted fewer people to suffer as he had. That's where his energy went, into quiet impact, not headlines. Tom Cruise, when he heard about the extent of Kilmer's behind-the-scenes generosity, was reportedly unsurprised. "Val gave more than he ever showed," he told a mutual friend. And that was his way. It's easy to talk about legacy in the context of awards and roles, but Kilmer's legacy was about care, about crafting a life that left something behind, not for cameras, but for communities, for artists, for his children. He didn't need applause. He needed to feel like he mattered. And in these private acts of service, we see the fullness of the man behind the characters. Not Batman, not Iceman, not Morrison, just Val. A giver, a guardian, a quiet force of change. The note that stopped Mercedes in her tracks. Amid the documents and mementos left behind, there was one piece of Val Kilmer's goodbye that wasn't in his will. It wasn't dated. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was a handwritten note, tucked away in the drawer of his writing desk in Santa Fe, left there quietly, like a whisper. It said, "If I have to leave, let me leave something behind so those who stay can still hear me." Mercedes found it. She stood still for a long time after reading it, and then, with tears in her eyes, she chose to leave it exactly where he placed it. Unmoved, unchanged, as if touching it might take away its weight. This wasn't a note for legal closure. It was a message from a father who had spent the last decade preparing his family for this moment. A father who had thought through every letter, every video, every photograph. A man who had once spoken with such power on screen, now speaking most clearly through silence. Tom Cruise, when he was later told about the note, reportedly paused before saying a word. Then he said, "That sums him up perfectly. he never needed to shout to be heard. And that's the essence of Val Kilmer's goodbye. Not loud, not performative, just deeply intentional. Every act of parting was crafted with love, every word written with restraint. He knew that grief was not something to perform, but to walk through quietly, with presence. For Mercedes and Jack, that note became more than a keepsake. It became their father's final direction, a reminder that though his voice was gone, his presence would remain in everything he left behind. The final silence that spoke loudest. There was no celebrity-filled memorial, no televised funeral. When Val Kilmer passed, his family didn't host a star-studded event. Instead, they gathered in Santa Fe, just a few close friends, including Tom Cruise, surrounded by desert winds and the quiet hum of Kilmer's favorite music playing in the background. It was intentional. That's how Val wanted it. The man who once wore the cape of Batman, who stood toe-to-toe with the biggest names in film, chose to leave this world quietly, on his own terms. His death didn't dominate headlines. There were no trending hashtags. But those who truly knew him didn't need the noise. They understood that the silence he left behind was louder than any applause. Tom Cruise didn't release a public statement through press agencies. Instead, he made a simple private tribute shared with the family. Some stars fade. Val glowed, quietly, eternally. That line stuck with everyone who heard it. It wasn't meant to be broadcast. It was meant to be felt. In a world obsessed with spectacle, Kilmer's departure was a masterclass in restraint. And yet, it's that very restraint that made it unforgettable. Just like in Top Gun, Maverick, where his brief return shook audiences, not with words, but with presence. His passing had the same effect. There was no need for a curtain call. Val had already said his goodbyes. In letters, in looks, in the thoughtful placement of a handwritten note in a drawer. His final act was one of peace, not performance. Tom's farewell, our reflection. After Val Kilmer's passing, Tom Cruise chose silence over spectacle. There were no televised tributes, no talk show appearances, just a single powerful statement. Without Val, there would be no Iceman, and there would be no me as I am today. It wasn't just a reflection on Top Gun, it was a deeply personal acknowledgement of Kilmer's impact on his life. Cruise, known for his precision and passion, had always admired Kilmer's fearless dedication to the craft. Their bond went beyond film. It was grounded in mutual respect and quiet understanding. In private, Cruise grieved not for a co-star, but for a friend who had taught him the value of depth, stillness, and intention. Val Kilmer's legacy isn't defined by box office numbers or fame. It's felt in the small, meaningful moments he left behind. Letters to his children, scenes that didn't need words, and friendships that lasted beyond the screen. As Cruise once said privately, "If you knew Val, you didn't need him to say much, you just felt it." And now, as we say goodbye, that's exactly how the world remembers him, not with noise, but with quiet, lasting reverence.